How's it going, everybody? Welcome back into the SFS channel. My name is Gavin, and in this episode, we're going to be talking through some early lineup advice here for Week 14 fantasy football. This is a big one. This is your last chance, potentially, to lock in your fantasy playoff spot. And this week, we've got 6 teams on bye week. So you're kind of spread out across the board here. The depth that we have for each position is a little bit thinner. So in this episode, I'll be breaking down just over a handful of names at the running back position that I see as either starts or sits. Players that could have some boom potential, give you solid lineup performances, or could potentially be a bust performer this week as well. That could screw you over in your hopes and obviously aspirations to acquire that favorable seeding or simply that last playoff spot in your league. So, as always, if you're new around here, drop on down, smash that subscribe button. It means a lot to me here. We're trying to grow the community, and I want to help as many of you as possible as we make our way down the stretch run for this fantasy football season. As always, your questions can be answered down in the comment section below. As always, I get back to as many of you as possible. And we've also got that community Discord server, which, if I remember, I will pin in the comment section for you guys to take advantage of here down the stretch of this season. But with that being said, that was a whole lot of talking. Let's jump into my first player here for Week 14. All right, let's kick off today's episode talking some Kansas City Chiefs and their running back dynamic here. So this week, I'll be starting Isiah Pacheco with confidence in his matchup at Denver. Now, at face value, this can be a relatively stingy matchup for basically just facing off against this Broncos defense. This has been one of the best defensive football teams in the National Football League, just behind the San Francisco 49ers as overall team defense is concerned here. But for Kansas City, there's a couple of elements that I really like in this game that we haven't necessarily seen present for many opponents of the Broncos this year. Now, first and foremost, you've got a high-powered offense here with this Kansas City Chiefs team. This is an offense that I believe should have the opportunity to run up potentially a multi-score lead on this abysmal Broncos offense. And inevitably, you're going to get yourself, and I believe that this team will get itself into a very positive game script situation here for this first matchup with these teams for the 2022 season. So essentially, my thoughts, my analysis on this game here is that Kansas City, again, will have a multi-score lead at some point in the second half in this game and will really be able to lean on and benefit from having a physical and hard-nosed runner like Isiah Pacheco in that backfield leading the way for this offense. Now, the second thing that I like for this situation and the scenario here is the fact that Isiah Pacheco has been very productive in the opportunities he's gotten throughout this season. Now, he's 100% this team's starter, the team's lead back right now. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, obviously being on the injured reserve, contributes to that somewhat, although his snap count percentage was harshly deteriorating while he was still healthy here. But Pacheco put up 14 rushing attempts for 66 yards and a touchdown this past week, also caught 2 passes for 16 yards. 100% of his targets were caught. Coming off of this loss for Kansas City as well, I think that there will be a little bit more of a spark, a little bit more urgency for this team that obviously still wants to stay in the hunt for that number 1 overall playoff seed in the AFC. So somewhat of an emotional component here. I think that this Chiefs team has a lot to play for in this game. Denver's season, I'm really surprised that their defense just hasn't all but cracked and given up hope here, because this team has been through the ringer this year. Offensively, they can barely muster up points. They are, I believe, like one of the lowest scoring average teams of the 20 or the 2000 century here. It's been a pretty brutal season for this Broncos offense. I believe now their average is down somewhere around 14 points per game. They have only scored 3 touchdowns since October 31st, Halloween of this year. So craziness here from this Broncos offense in a very bad way. And Kansas City, I think, should be on the uptick here, looking to rebound from what was a pretty tough loss here this past week against Cincinnati. Ezekiel Elliott, the Dallas Cowboys, taking on the Houston Texans this week. Our second player up on the block this week, I will be starting Zeke with confidence here. This is a matchup for a player that I think that I was pretty down on a few weeks back after the Tony Pollard emergence and his real breakout game for this season. But Zeke has shown that in this 2022 Dallas Cowboys offense, with the offensive productivity they have, the defense setting them up in really good and advantageous positions, the frequent opportunities in the red zone and the touchdowns he's been getting the last 3 weeks, there is very much so a role for him still on this team. He's had 3 consecutive games of 15 or more rushing attempts, not to mention the minimal, but still somewhat present receiving involvement that he has. You've got a guy with 4 scores, like I said, in that last 3-game stretch, and again, 15 or more opportunities those 3 straight games. So you're getting a respectable level of involvement. And this week, with again those 6 teams being on bye here, that pushes players who would have been in the RB3 discussion up the board here. And for me, that makes Zeke a very strong running back to start in 12-team formats this week against a Houston Texans team at home that the Texans have just been god-awful. They just absolutely suck against the run. Their offense is horrid. You saw it last week. You saw the Cleveland Browns absolutely dismantle them in the special teams and defensive phase of the game. So I like this matchup here. This should be a second straight week. If you want to talk defenses, I loved the Dallas defense this past week against the Colts. Obviously, Dallas's defense has been awesome all year, but especially just with that really ugly Colts offense and really favorable matchup. They get back-to-back fantastic, phenomenal matchups here with a reeling Houston team basically in line for the number 1 overall pick. There's a lot to like in this matchup. Again, positive game scripts. You're talking goal line opportunities. I'd be shocked to see him not crack at least 1 or 2 looks inside the 5-yard line. I'm not saying score, but he should get the chance to score. If not, Tony Pollard will. I was actually interested to see that Tony got a couple of those inside the 5-yard line opportunities against Indianapolis on Sunday Night Football. But for Zeke here, he gets his opportunities. I'm expecting increased efficiency here, and then those very valuable premium touches in the red area. Devin Singletary, the first name in today's episode, taking on the New York Football Jets that I'll be covering as a sit candidate here. So if you didn't pay that much attention to the Bills' backfield last week, I don't blame you. It has been one of the more unflattering situations in the NFL this season. However, there's been a bit of a changing dynamic going on as of late. There's been some evolving and moving pieces here that are important to note. And while I've been a skeptic and very critical of Devin Singletary's fantasy football value here basically all season long and dating back to seasons past, this is a situation where it now becomes even worse. So even in this dire week where you've got 6 of the 32 teams, I'm going to do some quick math here just to figure out what percentage of the NFL teams that is. We are without 19% roughly of the NFL teams this week for our fantasy lineups. Devin Singletary's role has been diminished. So this past game, he had a 44% snap share in week 13 against the Pats. His backfield mate, James Cook, rose up to 43%, the rookie running back out of the University of Georgia, a second-round pick. So this is troubling for Singletary owners, of course, especially if you're dependent on him in your lineups. I think that he is a running back 3, an unfavorable flex option for this week, especially against a stingier Jets defense. I would prefer that if you're looking at Singletary as an RB3 and flex level candidate, you at least observe your wide receivers for this week and weigh the options that you have there, because I do think that the floor is incredibly low in this matchup. And as I talked about, as Josh Allen's, and this is weeks ago, as his elbow continues to get better here and we start to hear less and less about it, that means the passing game is going to scale up and ramp up a bit more, and obviously that being a negative for Singletary, who saw a couple of week spurt there where he was getting some more touches. Obviously now a young player getting involvement in that backfield. Jeff Wilson Jr. This one is arguably the most debatable of the week here, but what I'm going to do with Jeff Wilson Jr. this week is I'm going to plug my nose, I'm going to plug my ears too, I'm going to turn my face the other direction, and I'm going to start him as an RB2. Probably not what you thought I was going to say there, but I am willing to be hurt one more time by Jeff Wilson. I'll give him one more opportunity. The dynamic of this Miami-San Francisco game was so unique this past week that I almost want to pretend it didn't exist. I think that between Mike McDaniel, just maybe trying to overcompensate a little bit. He's been a fantastic genius level coach for much of this season and done wonders for guys like Tua's stock and many others in that offense. Of course, he's done really well with the weapons he's had and elevated the play of his personnel. Then you had the odd situation and dynamic of Jimmy Garoppolo going down in this game. You had the Brock Purdy situation, and then, of course, playing against a world-class San Francisco 49ers defense. McDaniel somehow managed to muster out 8 total opportunities for running backs in the backfield this past game, and 33 yards was the result. 1 carry for 3 yards was the resulting factor for Jeff Wilson Jr., who was actually outsnapped 37% to 61% by Raheem Mostert. And as I said, it was 8 total rushing attempts, not 8 total opportunities. So this was about as an ugly game as it gets, although the circumstances I feel were very extreme as well. This San Francisco defense should not be underrated or underappreciated. The things that they're doing on the football field are special. So I'm really trying, and not to mention they're incredibly familiar with the San Francisco offensive schematic philosophy, because obviously they play against it at practice every single week, which is obviously a very, very strong influence in what McDaniel runs in Miami. So for Wilson, I love the matchup at Los Angeles this week. I think as long as Tua is healthy, there's actually a chance that this Dolphins team routs the Chargers. I think they're significantly better coached. I think that they should have a positive game script here. I think McDaniel will get his head out of his ass and actually run the ball this week. There's a lot of things I expect to change for this Dolphins offense here. And even if Tua's out and Skylar Thompson steps in at quarterback, you are going to see a situation where this team then has to run the ball more. So Jeff Wilson sucking it up one more time here. I've got him as a top 24 play for this week. Maybe a bit wary of him as a flex candidate if you do have a strong third wide receiver option, but those are my thoughts on this game right now as I record this episode actually late on a Monday evening. DeAndre Swift here taking on the Detroit Lions, that was extremely poorly said there. Of the Detroit Lions taking on the Minnesota Vikings. There we go. Second time's the charm there. DeAndre Swift, of course, made our lives a whole lot more interesting in that Week 13 matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, where essentially, just as I had reluctantly kind of died on my sword and, kind of just wrote him off here, he comes storming right back into our lives and once again looks like the potential week/league winning running back that I expected he could be all this time. And of course, it's ironically the week that I'd given up on him and I was ready to just rock with Jamal Williams the rest of the season going forward. DeAndre Swift rockets up to a 51% snap count percentage for the first time above 50% since Week 8, where he had 55% of the team's offensive snap share. And Jamal Williams plummeted down to a 30% snap share after being 40% or better from Week 9 onward, hence the week after Swift's final high snap count percentage game. Now, is DeAndre Swift your traditional workhorse fantasy football running back? No. 55 and 51, 58%, whatever the numbers were. That isn't spectacular, but what it is the lead back in this offense. And we know DeAndre Swift is incredibly skilled. He is very talented. He is explosive. He is dynamic. He basically checks in the skill department every single box that you want to see from a top-tier fantasy football running back. Now, this is a guy who has a backfield mate in Jamal Williams that has scored 8 touchdowns in his last 6 appearances on the football field. But Swift came rallying right on back here with, again, the team high in terms of the backfield snap count percentage, leading Jamal by 21%. He had 20 opportunities, 111 scrimmage yards, 14 rushing attempts, 6 receptions, and Jamal had just 11 total opportunities for 35 yards. So it was a pretty evident imbalance here. If DeAndre Swift is actually healthy and they're going to use him in this way going forward, we got to think about starting him. And in this week's matchup, with the circumstances I've repeated ad nauseum with the bye weeks here, I think you have to. I think he's a top 24 play. I think that there is a world in which I'm also starting Jamal Williams. Maybe not necessarily if you've got them on the same fantasy team. We'll see depending on your circumstances. Of course, as I said, the comment section is always open. But for DeAndre Swift here, I do have him as a top 24 play. I've got Jamal currently early in the week here as a fringe top 24 option, maybe in that flex level territory and that tier lower there. Obviously, always a threat inside the 5-yard line to score a touchdown. He's got 13 total scores now on the year. So this will be an interesting one to keep our eyes on. I do like the matchup, so to me, it's going to come down to usage. This will be one of the stories potentially of the season end here in 2022 fantasy football. Now, for Cam Akers taking on the Las Vegas Raiders, I am incredibly shocked that I'm going to be saying this here, But for Cam Akers, this is someone that I would contemplate starting in deeper formats. So your 12, potentially 14-man leagues, I actually have Cam ranked as an RB2 for this week inside of my top 24. Now, he might be around number 23 or 24. The tiers will drop tomorrow, the tiers and rankings. So stay tuned for that, of course. If you're new around here, make sure to subscribe, turn the bell on so you're notified as soon as my new episodes drop every morning. But for Cam Akers here, after all the Kyren Williams hype, after all of the discussion about the potential changing scenario of the Rams backfield, Cam Akers storms out here, 72% snap share, very inefficient still. That's something that I expect to be part of his weekly outlook here going forward this season. He had just 3.53 yards per carry, but he did have 18 opportunities, nearly 20. It's a pretty important number there for 60 yards and 2 total touchdowns. Now, I believe this week he will still be fairly touchdown dependent, or he will need to rip a big run, which hasn't been something the Rams have been able to do all year. But my main thing that I keep coming back to for this Rams offense, and kind of talked about this earlier last week as well, is that this team is literally forced to run the football. Their passing game is so bad that they have to lean on their running backs, and they have to try and at least make an honest attempt to establish a run game here. And that's great for us, because if you manage to scoop Akers up off the waiver wire, if you have just, sat through the pain and rostered him throughout this season, he may now have viability to you in a pretty important matchup. So my expectations and my bar is pretty low here in terms of what I'm looking for out of him. But in a half PPR format, somewhere between 10 and 12 points seems fairly realistic, especially if he does squirt into the end zone. So I do think that there is a very interesting scenario here where Cam Akers could be a contributor for a lot of lineups. Again, he's a lower end RB2 for me, and the Rams, they just have to have some sort and facet of a run game to be able to sustain some level of competitiveness. And let's face it, this Raiders defense, as much as I like them as a stream candidate this week, that's more so for what they can do against the pass, sacking John Wolford, picking him off. I think that there is opportunity for yardage to be gained here by Akers. Now, someone that I have ranked below Cam Akers and below some of our other starts for this week in the sit column is Latavius Murray, who I have as a running back 3 for this week. Again, it's a risky bust potential flex opportunity. You can always still find an explanation for why you have to start these guys. Of course, I'm just outlining some of my concerns for these players. But Denver has Kansas City this week. They just scored 9 points last week. If you think that an emotionally driven Kansas City team that we talked about at the opener here with Isiah Pacheco is going to come out here and lay down to this terrible Broncos offensive attack, I think you're gravely mistaken. I think that Denver plays trailing for much of, if not the entire football game. There's a solid chance that Kansas City, if they receive the opening possession, walk down the field and score not even a touchdown, but 3 freaking points, they could control the entire pace, tempo, and game script of the 4-quarter football game. Latavius Murray, obviously, as a running back that isn't super dynamic, he did catch 4 passes this week for a grand total of 14 yards, but he's very dependent on having the opportunity to run the ball on first and second down. So even though he had a 68% snap count percentage, 21 opportunities this week, 17 rushes, only 47 yards at 2.76 yards per carry, I don't think there's a whole lot to like here. I think that, like I said, in a standard format, maybe, just maybe, you could make an argument for him to squirt into the 24th or 25th ranked running back position for this week. The ceiling is so low, though, as it is. The floor might be even worse in this game, and this is an all-out stay away for me. So, Latavius Murray, the Broncos offense, there is one player that will make my start list from the Broncos offense. You'll see that in another episode today, so make sure to go check that out live on the channel now. But Latavius Murray certainly does not meet that qualification for me. So, to recap today's episode, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. I appreciate the heck out of all you. I will be starting Isiah Pacheco in Week 14. I'll also be starting Ezekiel Elliott. I'll be sitting down Devin Singletary, but I will be starting Jeff Wilson. Again, we're plugging our nose here, closing our eyes, turning the other direction. For DeAndre Swift, another just kind of grimacing your teeth. You're making the start, though. Cam Akers, another situation. Desperate times call for desperate measures here. And we're going to be taking advantage of that to the extent that we have to. Not saying that I'm starting him over elite options this week, but I do think he provides fringe level serviceability here. And then Latavius Murray, our other sit candidate for this week. It's pretty dang tough to pull out sit candidates that don't feel like you're just tossing names out there because the options we have here in week 14 are so limited. So there you guys have it, our 7 pieces of early running back lineup advice for week 14 fantasy football. As always, good luck this week, you guys. I've got your back. I will help out as many of you as I possibly can, whether it's the Discord server. Again, the invite link is in the description, or whether that's through the comment section below. I'm here to be a tool and a resource, so take advantage of me, and I will do my best to get back to you and obviously help you out for your teams in the stretch run here. So thanks so much, you guys. I'll see you in the wide receivers episode, which comes out today as well. Peace out.